Jim. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Hey everybody, this is Jim. I'm a manager of software consulting with Dean Dortmund. Hope everybody is doing well. I know I am about as happy as can be because we have entered pumpkin spice season, and that is when I thrive. So today I want to talk to you about spend management in Sage Intacct. We'll talk about the spend management module, and we'll also talk about how to apply the module to automate tracking and release of committed spend in Sage Intacct. So before we get too deep into it, I do want to send out a reminder to everyone that we have a training survey going around. So we're working on developing some affordable instructor-led training programs focused on Sage Intacct. I'm writing them, just full disclosure. So it's not like we're outsourcing this thing. So I'm writing these trainings. We're looking to provide you hands-on examples, and you will be able to work in an actual demo environment of Sage Intacct with real-world scenarios. So if you can please fill out this survey, it would be greatly helpful for us to understand what kind of training you're interested in having and what kind of timeline you'd be looking to do that training in. So back on topic, the objectives today, at the end of the session, hoping you'll be able to do these things. So I'm hoping you'll be able to articulate the steps that you need to track and release committed spend using purchasing. Learn how to create a financial report that shows actual spend and committed spend. Look at preemptive spend insight information on a spending transaction, and explain the options that you have for spend management validation. There's some helpful kind of prior knowledge or prerequisites coming into this topic. If you don't have them, it's not the end of the world, but it will help if you've experienced these kinds of things, even just tangentially. So if you've worked with the purchasing module, it's even better. If you happen to have worked with the purchasing module throughout an entire workflow cycle, meaning from a purchase requisition to the order to the vendor bill. It also will help if you have some experience with creating or working with transaction definitions, which exist in order entry and purchasing. Basically, that means rules for defining where and how a purchasing document is going to post. And then finally, if you have some knowledge of user-defined books and using book stacking in financial reporting, you would find that useful as well. So when I do any session, I always like to start out with the end goal in mind. What we're looking at here is the capability to automate the tracking and release of committed spend and to be able to analyze our actual spend plus our commitments against the budget. So at the end of all this, we want to be able to produce a financial report that looks something like what you see on the screen. So you can see we have our actual spend, which is separate from any commitments that we might have from our purchase orders. We have a column for our commitments, which is purchase orders that we may have issued but have not yet had a vendor bill against. And then we have our actual plus our commitments. So what does this give us? It gives us analysis into a budget versus actual, whether or not we've actually gotten a vendor invoice yet. Sometimes what happens is when you're analyzing actual versus budget, you might think that you're in a really good place, but you actually have a whole slew of commitments that may be out there that are not on your books yet. And if you're not analyzing your budget holistically and looking at your actual and your commitments and comparing that to your budget, you could find yourself with some pretty unfortunate surprises. Kind of like going to Starbucks and finding out that they're out of PSL. Nobody's happy. So, I have a little screen freeze. There we go. So, this is a simple graphic of the process that I like to use and recommend for tracking and release of committed spend. And notice all throughout this, we have the spend management module giving us validation of whether or not something is in budget. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit more depth as we get into the examples. So the concept of committed spend, as I said, gives you insight into not only the expenses that you've already incurred, but the expenses that you expect to incur in the future. And Sage Intacct lets you track that committed spend pretty easily by using purchasing transactions that are mapped to hit user-defined books. Now, committed spend, as I've kind of been hammering home, is a really valuable management tool because it helps management understand their costs better. But for our official financial presentation, we probably only care about what's been incurred. So the reason that mapping to a user-defined book is helpful is because we have the option to present our financial statements with the user-defined book or without it. So this means you can have financial statements for a project manager, for a program manager that could have both their actual and committed spend. But when you give your financial statements to an auditor or a board member, that may include only the expenses that you've actually incurred. So by using this 4-step workflow like we see on the screen, the process of moving your spend from committed spend into your actuals is as easy as just converting documents within the purchasing module. So this is about getting rid of some of your guesswork that you're doing so that you can figure out where your P&L is going to end up at the end of the period. It's taking a function that for many people, including myself as a past controller or CFO, they will spend hours or days using Excel to forecast and try to figure out and layer in all the different places where they haven't spent something yet, but they know they're going to, and then they can compare that against the budget. Now, this function is transformed from something you have to string together into something that gives you real-time intelligence. And by laying the spend management module on top of all this, we can have validation against the budget every single step of the way. So before you've even committed to incurring an expense, all the way back at the purchase requisition step, we can have spend management checking that expense and telling you in real time if that transaction is going to cause you to go over budget. We can have spend management giving you real-time insights into what you're going to have left to spend if you submit the purchase requisition and it gets approved. Yes, that's great information for accounting and finance, but it's also great information for project managers, program managers, department heads, directors, all these different people that you want to hold accountable for financial results that are under their purview. And the best part of it is that it's very easy to set up and get rolling. So what are the steps to set this up? It's really kind of an 8-step workflow that I like to think of. Let's talk about it high level, and then we'll go into the steps in a little bit more detail. So you need to do these 8 steps. You need to subscribe to the modules you need. You need to enable user-defined books, create a user-defined book and journal, make sure you've enabled advanced workflows in purchasing, create transaction definitions in purchasing, enable the validate purchasing and spend management, enable include committed expenses in spend management, and then you're going to build a financial report with the user-defined book or column stacked. So let's dive into each of these steps. And throughout this, I will also have demo so that we can put things into a more real-world and practical lens. So step 1, make sure you subscribed to all the right modules. Let's review what those are. So the modules you need are the core, which includes purchasing. Sometimes people have the core and they don't turn purchasing on. For a workflow like this, turning purchasing on can be very valuable. And the other subscription you need is spend management. Spend management is an additional subscription outside of the core. To perform all the tasks that we're going to talk about, you'll need to be a full business user in Intacct, and you're going to need permissions to the purchasing module. So an employee user can submit the requisition transactions in the purchasing module, so they can do a small piece of what we're going to go over, but obviously to set it up, you're going to need to be a business user, and to do anything beyond a purchase requisition, you will need a business user. For a requisition, you can have an employee user. And then there's also some configuration choices that we'll want to make sure that we have selected in our module screens. So in GL, we need to make sure we've enabled user-defined books. In purchasing, we need to enable advanced workflows. If you're not already using advanced workflows, just note that changing to advanced workflows is a permanent selection, and it will also be a selection that is in your order entry module. Now, I think that the advanced workflows are much better than using a standard workflow because you get a lot more flexibility with them. So you're really not giving anything up by moving to an advanced workflow. You're just giving yourself more functionality. And then in the spend management module, you need to make sure that you've turned on the options to validate purchasing and to include committed expenses. So here's just screenshots of what access levels you need in your subscription. So you want to make sure purchasing is turned on, spend management is turned on, that you've done the configuration in the screens, and we'll go a little bit more into what that looks like. Again, another screenshot. Here's what your permission should look like to make sure that you can do the kind of stuff that we're talking about today. So make sure you can work with transaction definitions, make sure you can work with purchasing transactions. You may not necessarily need the delete permission, but if you're a full admin, it's probably easiest on yourself to just give yourself anything so you can do whatever you want. All right, these next few steps, we're going to go through these pretty quick because they're very easy setup steps. So the first is in general ledger setup, make sure that you've selected the configuration choices you see on the screen. So underneath advanced GL options and GL setup, you're going to see a checkbox for enable user-defined books. These user-defined books are where the committed spend transactions are going to be flowing into and out of, so they're very important to have. And then in purchasing, make sure that you've enabled advanced workflows. Advanced workflows are going to allow you to have flexibility as to how things post when you submit a purchasing transaction. So how do you create a user-defined book or journal? Well, you have the navigation paths here on the slide. So under GL setup, you have the capability to add a user-defined book. I usually give it the book ID commitment to track the committed spend that's going to be coming from a PO. And then a user-defined journal, you have to have at least one user-defined journal for every user-defined book. So I will create a user-defined journal, which has a symbol that indicates that it's for committed spend, and I will make that part of the user-defined book. That's all there is to the setup there. Now I'm going to demo steps 1 through 4 for you to put it in a little bit more real-life context. And also, just a reminder, if you have any questions as I'm going through all of this, put them in the Q&A. I will be getting to them probably around the end of the presentation. So if I'm looking in my Sage Intacct environment, I'm here in a demo environment of Sage Intacct. And as I mentioned, we want to make sure that we do the demo for step 1 through 4. So how do I get to the subscriptions for the different modules I need? All I have to do is go to company, go to admin. Obviously, you need to have the right permissions to do this, and go to subscriptions. You want to make sure that you've turned on purchasing, which you will see down here. And then you want to make sure that you've turned on spend management. Now, in spend management, I've mentioned there's some options you need to check in the configuration. The configuration of spend management is probably one of the simplest configurations you're ever going to see. So here I've got what budget am I validating against? So once I have a budget in the system, I can tell spend management, look at this budget when you are evaluating whether or not something is going over budget. Tell it when to start doing that validation. And this checkbox here for if no budget match, treat as 0. Some people love it, some people don't love it, which is why it's a checkbox that you can choose to turn on if you want to or not. So if this box is checked, if something is not in your budget and somebody submits an expense for it, Intacct is going to pretend like you don't have any budget for that, because you really don't, and you didn't want anything to be coded against that. So you will get either an error message or a full stop, depending on how you configured the module. We can have over budget notifications go to someone. So if I check this, I can put in the email address for a budget administrator, and they can get daily, weekly, or monthly notifications about what's going over budget. Here I can choose what I want Intacct to validate against. So I can pick which dimensions do I want to validate against. So if it's really important for me to have departmental budgeting, then I want to validate against the departments that are in my budget. If it's really important for me to have location budgeting, I'm going to validate against the locations and make sure that for any given location or for any given department, I can validate that budget and make sure I'm not going over, or if I am going over, that I can raise a flag. You want to make sure that you check to validate purchasing. So that means that transactions coming from purchasing are going to be subject to spend management validation. You can also validate transactions coming from accounts payable or transactions coming from the general ledger. So, and then you have the budget exceeded treatment. So you can say, if something's going over budget, issue a warning. If you choose to issue a warning, that means that somebody will get a warning message and they'll be able to repeat their action to go ahead with their transaction anyway. If you choose for it to be a full stop, if somebody tries to save a transaction that will cause them to go over budget, they're going to get an error message and they will not be able to do anything until they've rectified that situation. So either the budget is going to have to be modified, or somebody's going to have to get in there and make a change, code it somewhere else, but it's going to prompt a discussion because they're not going to be able to move forward until they've solved that problem. Then finally, we can say committed expenses should be included. So when I'm validating my budget and considering if I'm going over the budget or not, I can look at the committed expenses that I haven't necessarily gotten an invoice for, but I know I have an outstanding PO that I've committed to. And I can include that so that if somebody submits a requisition and it would go over budget between my actual plus my commitments, they're going to get a flag or they're going to be stopped. When you enable purchasing, you're going to get the option for which purchasing transaction definitions you want that spend management to fire on. So here I'm having it fire on requisition and committed PO. Always a good idea to start that as early on in the purchasing workflow as you can, because if you wait till the vendor invoice, in a lot of cases, it might be too late, right? So if you've got a vendor invoice that's come in, presumably they've already provided the services, they've already delivered the goods, and you might not be able to do anything about the fact that that blew the budget. But if you've got it all the way back when somebody's requesting to spend something that it's going to go over budget, you can reject that right then and there. And then finally, you have to do some item GL group mapping to tell Intacct for a requisition which GL accounts are associated with which GL groups, because remember, a requisition doesn't actually post to the GL. So basically what you're defining down here is, if this requisition did post to the GL, here are the accounts that it would hit. And that way, Intacct will always know what budget to validate against. So those are the options in configuring spend management. Pretty easy. A couple other easier things in the general ledger configuration. As I mentioned, in the advanced section, you want to enable user-defined books. And then you want to make sure that you've set up a user-defined book. So under setup, you can go to user-defined books and make sure that you've added one for commitments. I usually just spell it out, very obvious what it is. And then I make sure that I go to journals, my user-defined journals, and I've added a committed spend journal, which lives inside my commitment book. So all of that is foundational to this functionality working seamlessly. Finally, inside the purchasing module, you want to make sure that you've turned on advanced workflows. So if we look down a little bit, enable advanced workflow, I mean, we really consider it a best practice to turn these on, whether you've got spend management or not, but you definitely want to have them turned on if you're using spend management, because it helps with this committed spend analysis. So that is steps 1 through 4. I'm going to pick back up at step 5 in my process, which is creating transaction definitions in purchasing. So transaction definitions, as I have mentioned, are the mechanism through which the method of tracking, releasing, and validating committed spend against the budget is possible. So in this step, we're going to create 4 transaction definitions, which are going to allow us to take a transaction from its initial step of a requisition all the way through booking the actual invoice received from our vendor and validating this transaction against the budget all the while. And as we do this, Intacct is going to seamlessly be moving our spend into and out of the committed spend buckets based on the configuration. So let's talk about the transaction definitions that we have to create. So you've got 4 transaction definitions. You've got a requisition. That just kicks off the process. It does not post to the GL. It does not post to any books. Then from the requisition, if that requisition gets approved, if you have an approval workflow, of course, you can turn it into a committed PO. The committed PO establishes the committed spend. So whether or not you've received an invoice or not yet, you're going to know I've committed to spending $100,000 with this vendor. And you'll be able to report against that when you're considering your budget versus actual. Then we've got 2 other steps. And these 2 steps, as I note in red, they can be achieved in a single transaction definition, or you can do it in 2 steps. There's reasons to do it either way. I like to do it with the 4-step approach, but if you're ever interested in the 3-step approach, we can talk about that, and I do have information about that in the appendix. So the 3rd step in the workflow is a document that releases the commitment. So when you receive an invoice from your vendor, say they've invoiced you $20,000 out of the $100,000, we're going to convert our committed PO into a release of commitment for $20,000. What that's going to do is it's going to leave the other $80,000 behind in committed spend, and it's going to take $20,000 out of committed spend. And then step 4, you will be converting it into a vendor bill. So you'll convert it into, say, a $20,000 vendor bill. So the effect of that is moving out of the committed spend bucket into the actual spend bucket. But all throughout that process, you have validation and visibility into what your full budget versus actual is. Using this 4-step approach gives you surefire automation of moving amounts into and out of the committed spend bucket, and it's going to give you full visibility into how much expense you've incurred, how much you're still expecting to incur, and what the total is, so that you can make decisions based not only on what's happened, but what is projected to happen in the future. And then Intacct will be handling the budget validation for you via spend management, so that users will have warnings if an account balance will go over budget with the committed spend taken into consideration. So let's talk a little bit more about the setup for each of these transaction definitions. The first transaction definition is purchase requisition, and I've given you throughout the slides here the key setup steps for you to be able to set this up. So when you want to set up a requisition, you're going to go to setup in the purchasing module, transaction definitions. These are the important things you want to make sure that you choose. Remember, this is a non-posting transaction, and for partial conversions, you want to make sure you leave that transaction open so that if you need to convert part of it and then convert another part later, it's easy to do. Remember, what this does is it kicks off the process. It's not posting to any books or any GL accounts. It's not creating committed spend yet. It's just somebody asking, hey, can I spend this money? Then you got step 2, which is your committed PO. So this is where we are creating committed spend. It's creating the committed expense in a user-defined book so that you have the flexibility to report with and without committed spend. And it also enables you to do budget versus actual with the committed spend. Here are the key things that you need to make sure you pay attention to when you're configuring this. So note our template type and workflow category here changed to order. And in terms of workflow, we want this to be converted from a requisition. So the workflow is somebody will create a requisition. Once that requisition gets approved, somebody will then be able to convert that requisition into a committed PO. Notice that in the security configuration, I've set my create policy to convert only. So I don't want somebody to create a committed PO out of thin air. I want them to create a committed PO from an approved requisition. You can do it without the approved requisition, but then you're not really getting the approval, obviously. And if they've already committed to it, it might be too late. So think about that when you're planning your workflows. Third step, release of commitment. So what happens is you get a vendor invoice. You want to take that vendor invoice out of committed spend and put it into AP, essentially. So what this release of commitment does is it takes the expense out of the user-defined book. Again, notice that I put our workflow category as shipping just because it helps graphically in the purchasing workflow. But the important parts here are our transaction conversion. So it can be created from a committed PO. Again, I want to leave it open if it's a partial conversion so I can convert the rest later. And my security configuration is still convert only. So I want to make sure somebody's creating this from a committed PO. They're not creating a release of commitment out of thin air. That could be messy for accounting. Then finally, the vendor bill, which is a familiar transaction definition to a lot of people already. So it's an invoice, template type, and workflow category. We want to convert it from a release commitment. So in our transaction conversion, we're going to say this can be created from a release of commitment. And in our security configuration, we want to make it convert only because, again, this should be being converted from a release of commitment. It should not be created out of thin air. And what this does is it puts the expense into your accrual books and posts the bill to accounts payable. So after you've created the transaction definitions, make sure you do this step. This is a very common step that even I miss when I'm going through it sometimes. And then I go to create a transaction, I get an error message. So if you are creating a purchasing document or an order entry document for that matter, that is posting to GL, which are committed PO transaction and release of commitment are posting to GL, not to AP. If you're creating a transaction definition that posts to general ledger, you need to make sure you go to your purchasing setup documents configuration here and tell Intacct what purchase journal to use. If you don't fill this in, you're going to get error messages when you go to create transactions, and then you're going to have to go fill it in anyway. So try to remember to do that as you're setting it up, because they need to flow into the GL, and in order to flow into the GL, they need to know what journal they're going in. Couple more steps. So we enable validate purchasing and spend management, enable include committed spend and spend management. So I kind of already showed you that when we did the demo earlier, but here's the screenshots of it just for ease of reference. So make sure that you check these boxes, that you check for validate purchasing, that you check for include committed expenses. That's going to give you full visibility into your budget versus actual with and without committed. Validate purchasing, again, make sure that your basic spend management validation is set first. So make sure that you choose what budget it's going against and make sure that that budget has the dimension level detail that you want to validate against. So for example, if you want to validate budget versus actual on a department level, you need to make sure that you're at least budgeting to the department level. Otherwise, it's not going to be a very meaningful analysis if everything comes up out of the budget. Choose a duration. So when you choose a duration, you can choose whatever you want. I've seen a lot of clients use something that's like current year or fiscal current year if their month-to-month budgeting is not super precise. So say you've got a budget for professional services, it's $100,000 for the year. You don't necessarily know maybe when that $100,000 is going to fall on a month-to-month basis. So if you're not concerned about the month-to-month budget versus actual being perfect, you're concerned more about a year-to-date or current year as a whole, choose a duration that fits well with that. Because if you have $100,000 as a budget in professional services and you just put $7,000 a month for certain months, maybe $10,000 in others, whatever you need to do to make it come out to 100, you're gonna have to deal with budget versus actual within the given month if you're still not over budget for the year as a whole. So just think about what time period matters when you're validating. Again, with purchasing documents, as I said, you need to choose which documents you're validating. I would say at least validate the requisition and the committed PO, maybe validate the vendor invoice. It really depends on your workflow. Like, are you using a requisition or are you starting at a PO? Are you not doing any of that? You're doing a vendor invoice, in which case it might be too late by the time the vendor invoice shows up, but at least it would tell you if it's going to go over budget. Maybe then you can do some kind of negotiating. And then when you choose to validate a requisition type document, because it does not post to the GL, just remember you have to give Intacct the mapping for your item GL group to your general ledger account. With all these steps completed, we're ready to start using the tool that we built. So I'm going to demo step 6 and 7, right? And then I'm going to show you spend management validation and spend insights. So step 6 and 7 we talked about already in setting up the advanced workflow and configuring spend management validation. So now let's put it all together and show you how it works and why it's magic. So here I have an example of a request that I know is going to be acceptable. If I am entering a requisition here in Intacct, I'm going to go in. I could be an employee user doing this because they're allowed to enter requisitions. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to enter all the details about my requisition. And when you have spend management turned on, you have this nifty button here called Show Spend Insight. If I click that button, I'm going to see immediate information about what is my budget for this? What have I actually incurred so far? Do I have any committed expenses floating out there already? How much this purchase is and what I'll have left after this purchase. So you can see this will pass along just fine. So if I post this, that's going to sail right through. That's posted, it's pending. If there was an approval process, then somebody would approve it. Beautiful, that's done. Now I've got this over budget request. So let's contrast what that would look like. Here I've got a request for catering for the Hufflepuff House for this amount of money. If I look at the spend insight here, I can see that my budget was $25,000. I don't have anything in actual committed yet, but this is going to put me over budget by negative $6,000 because I don't know what in the world they were thinking spending that much on the Hufflepuff House when nobody even likes them anyway. So that's where that generated from. So if I go to post it, I have the warning methodology turned on right now. So if I go to post it, I'm going to get this warning message that says the transaction exceeds the budget limit and tells them to either reduce the transaction amount or work with their budget admin to address it. And the warning methodology, as I mentioned, they can repeat the action and do it anyway. So I could say, post it, and it's going to post. Eventually, we're going to have to deal with that budget overage, but whatever, it's going through at the moment. So from the requisition, I'm then going to be able to create a committed PO. And just for clarity here, if I look at a financial statement right now, let's see, these were dated 11/1/19. So if I look at a financial statement for the month of November, I'm going to see right now, this is high level, not location by location, but I also have a location by location version. And in both cases, you can see there's no actual, well, there's some actual here, but there's no commitments outstanding for any of the various locations, which are across the top. And there is no, I did that wrong. I apologize. I used the wrong year because I'm not in 2019 anymore. So there we go. Back in 2019, we can see I've got actual of 0, commitments of 0, and all these different ones. And so you can see that we've got our budget and nothing has gone on yet. Same thing here. Put this WebEx thing out of my way. Same thing here. If I look at 12/31/19, year ending 12/31/19, no commitments, got a budget. So the minute that I do this convert, I convert this to a committed PO. I'm going to date this 11/2/19 to stay in the same time period as my example. Again, my spend insight is still going to tell me you're still over budget. And I'm going to say, that's nice. I'm going to do it anyway. And then I'm going to go back to my requisition, and I'm also going to convert the one that was not over budget. So I'm converting these things, and in the background, I'll show you what Sage Intacct is doing. I refresh these reports. So I'm going to refresh this one first. See, my commitments have shown up. I haven't actually gotten a vendor invoice yet, but I do have commitments, and that's important to know. So I can see that my actual with commitments is 42,250, and that means that I only have 539,750 left. If I wasn't capturing these commitments, I would think that I still had $582,000 to blow. So that's where this starts to come into play and be really valuable. And if I refresh this report, it's even more granular for somebody on a location by location basis. So you can see, hey, I've got 31,250 for the full year. That means that I've got 68,750 left in the budget. And then same thing here, I've got 109,000. Ravenclaws are always better at managing their budget. And then you can see organization-wide. Say that the vendor sends an invoice for a piece of this. So now I've got a committed PO. I want to convert this. So the vendor's given me an invoice for half of it. All right, I'll make it easy on myself. So on 11/3/19, the vendor gives me an invoice for 125 of the 250. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to convert this. So I've got a release of commitment because I've got an invoice. Post that. Let's take a look at the impact before I go on to the next step. So here we've got committed spend of 42,250 when I reload this page. I now have committed spend of less than that because we moved it out. Now it's very important to then do the next step, which is convert this release of commitment into a vendor invoice and post that. So it's a very logical workflow. It's just convert, post, and Intacct is making all the movements for you behind the scenes. So now when I reload this, I've got my actual of the vendor invoices. Here's what's left that they haven't invoiced me for yet. Here's my grand total. So it's a much different analysis and much more detailed analysis than I had coming into this. And the same thing is true of when I look at my release commitment for the other one. So when I look at my committed PO, I see partially converted. So that means that, as I mentioned, we want to make sure it's open for conversion. So when I look at this PO, I'm going to see that it's partially converted, and here's how much I have left to convert. So 125 has been converted already. That means I'll be able to convert another 125. So if I were to go to more actions, convert it to a release of commitment, it's only going to allow me to convert whatever's left, right? So it lets you take it in stages as the vendor's invoicing you, because the vendor's not always invoicing you 100% at any given time. So that's the movement of committed spend throughout the financial statements and the workflow for what that looks like. So now we're into the financial statement build, because obviously I just showed you some financial statements that enable you to get some better insight into this. Let's talk about how that happens. So the way that this happens, and this is the end result slide that I showed you at the beginning of the session. The way that this happens is you're using book stacking, essentially. So the first column in this report is your actual results. The second column is the amounts from your user-defined book, which displays the amounts that are in your committed spend journal. And then your last column is what's called book stacking, which takes your commitments and puts them on top of your actual to get your fully loaded result. So this basically sums the two together. And on this report, because of all the setup that we've performed, we have a clear view of actual expenses incurred, what's been committed, and what the total of our actual plus commitments is. And then there's a comparison of that combined total to the budget. Very useful for management reporting. And if we had a different audience where one of these numbers didn't matter, we could pull them out of the report. That's the flexibility of having these amounts in another book. So let's take a look at how this is built in the financial report writer so you know how easy it is to build and tweak this report. And we're into another demo. So this is the end result report. This is one version of it that's not expanded by location. This is just the same report that happens to be expanded by location. How did I build it? Well, if I go to my budget versus actual with commitments here and I hit edit, what's important here, the rows obviously is the GL accounts that we want to display in this report. So here's all the different GLs. But in the columns, this is where we really get the power of using that committed spend. So notice here in column 2, I've got my actuals, and my reporting book is accrual, and that's it. So this is my actual before any commitments are taken into account. In column 3, I've still got my actual. I'm titling this column commitments so that it's super clear for the end user. And if I look at my reporting book and I hit edit books, I can see that I've chosen the commitments book, and more importantly, I've unchecked this box that says include the main reporting book accrual. So what that means is I'm going to be able to see only the amounts that were posted to my commitment book. That gives me isolated reporting of what's committed and what's actual. And then finally, in column 4, I've got my actual. I'm titling it actual with commitments to keep it clear for the user. And I'm doing what we call book stacking. Book stacking sounds really fancy. This is all it is. I've included my commitment book and I've checked this box instead of unchecking it. Magic, I did book stacking. And what this does is it combines the actual amounts and your commitments book amount and totals them together. Finally, here I've got my budget. So I've got a budget. I chose the budget that I wanted to display. It's for the current year, just like all these other columns. I'm keeping both of the books in there, so I'm book stacking again. And then on the variance, I'm having it calculate the variance versus that budget, and I'm book stacking. That's it. That's the build. As you probably know, you can do all kinds of filtering and prompting on your filter screen, but that is the build for getting a report like this or like this. The only difference between these two reports is that one is expanded by location and one is not. So it's really just a matter of how granular you want that to look. But I really like that. My favorite part about this is the partial conversion aspect is really handy. So I've got this 15,000 that represents a partial conversion of a PO, and the rest of that PO that hasn't been converted yet is still sitting in commitments. So I haven't forgotten about the fact that I've still committed to another 26K. Really valuable for management insight, especially on organizations who are on a tight budget, have cash flow struggles, any of the above, which most people have during COVID anyway. Really helpful to have that kind of analysis. All right, and with that, I do have time for questions. So does anyone have questions? I see something in the chat. The only thing I see in the chat, which I do want to remind you about, is Yelena has shared the link to our survey for the training. So I'll just pop to the next slide. Yelena shared this link in the chat. We would love if you guys could go and complete this survey. It would be very helpful to us to have that insight. If you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A. This is contact info for us. As a reminder, if you ever have any support needs or you want help looking into something like this further, just email our support email address and we'll be happy to help you with that.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. I actually did have a couple questions that came in privately. One was, can I use the spend management features or reports on dashboards for managers to look at?
I mean, you can. So what spend management does is it's really validating the transactions at the time that you're recording them. So it's really more of a control around when you're entering the transactions, but you can use spend management to give you the report presentation that I just showed, like with budget, actual committed spend and all that. And you could certainly stick those on a dashboard.
Okay. Thank you for that. And then the last one I have, I don't see anything else coming in, but can spend management validate multiple budgets?
Sorry, what was that question?
Can spend management validate against multiple budgets?
Oh, great question. No, it can't. Very simple answer. Right now, it is only one budget. So if you'd wanted it to validate against a different budget, you'd have to switch that budget in the spend management configuration screen.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Well, I don't see anything else coming in, so I hope everyone else has a good rest of your day. Jim, thank you. And if you guys think of anything else, please feel free to reach out. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you.